Mm.
Oh, no.
But now I do. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, the online forum where we talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Fell. Anders Wahlgren is not going to be able to join us today. He is had something come up. But we have a fantastic panel of people. I'm going to read through the topic. Today's topic is the must-haves for application release automation. What are the key prerequisites for automating and accelerating your software releases? How does application release automation help? And what are some of the challenges and patterns for success of ARA at scale? And as always, we have a fantastic panel of folks who are joining us. Hold on, let me see if I can find that slide. Boop. All right, let's start with Carl. Welcome to the program, Carl.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I do technical marketing at Puppet. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Fantastic. We're happy to have you here. Fabian, welcome
Hi.
to the program from Singapore, no less, at 1 o'clock in the morning. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. So I'm Fabian, currently working at GovTech in Singapore. So I'm one of the engineers that does DevOps with security in mind. So I'll try to spice up this discussion with a little more security concepts.
Caliente. I love it. Very good. All right, Fabian. And Mark Priolo, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Sam. Mark Priolo. I'm the Global Software Configuration Manager at Urban Science. My main goal is to set up continuous delivery and continuous deploy models for our company.
Excellent. All right. And so as part of the conversation today, we've obviously got some people who are online. If you are not online, but you would like to join the conversation, send a tweet out using the hashtag C9D9, and we'll try and incorporate it in the conversation. But let's get started with the actual conversation. Let's talk about we talked a little bit about why we're having this conversation. What are the benefits of application release automation, and why would people sort of pursue it? And let's start with Carl. Carl, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I've talked to a lot of people who are, deploying out applications. They do so every 6 months. It's a very painful process. It takes a long weekend. They all get on a conference call. They have a barrage of tickets and handoffs that they have to manage. And there, you look at that and you have to say there has to be a better way, and there is. And it's about removing a lot of the things that humans are bad at. Humans are very bad at doing the same repetitive tasks over and over and over again. That's what automation is all about, right? So it's all about taking the things that humans do over and over again, and you need something to be repeatable, so you automate it. And then you leave the humans for what they're good at, which is decision making. And it allows you to be able to say, I understand what's going on at this moment. I have predictions and expectations, and I can react when things are doing something differently than what I expect. And so it's about leaving the things that the machines are good at to the machines, and the things that the humans are good at to the humans. When you get to that point, now you can start to say things like, well, since we've reduced friction, since we have better expectations, since we have more faith in what we're going to do and what's going to happen when we do it, we can now start to change the way we do things. We can start to change the culture in which we interact. We can start to change the way we ship applications and the cadence in which we do that. At a shorter cadence, you can now innovate more. So application release automation isn't just about making the process more predictable. It's also about changing the way you act as a company, the way you innovate, and the way you deliver to your customers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually, you can see I'm in a hallway here. I'm in Orlando, Florida at the Gartner IT Operations and Solutions Summit, where we're talking with lots of enterprises who are trying to solve this application release problem. And the thing, I mean, Carl, you sort of talked about it a little bit, but the thing that they're all trying to get to is sort of that predictability. They're afraid of deployments into production because they're not sure exactly what's going to break. And a lot of the continuous delivery conversations and the DevOps conversations that people have had is all about sort of reducing that batch size. You can do it more frequently. You know when there's something that, because it's a small batch and you know what has been deployed that causes that problem. But to get that mindset, technology is part of it, but understanding sort of the cultural shift that shift to that different way of working is one of the people are really struggling, is to understand how do I, not just me, but how do I get my whole organization around that? Because the benefits is what we're talking about right now. The benefits are clearly there, right? More efficiency, better quality, better predictability. All those things are a great output from doing, but getting there is pretty tricky. Fabian, what are your thoughts on the benefits?
So for benefits, I kind of agree with him that we should leave machines to do what they're good at and humans to make the business decisions, right? And because you can't hire like 1,000 engineers to deploy 1,000 containers, you make the machines do it. So just leave the more intelligent decision making to the humans, and that way you can scale, right? If you're providing your business as a service, so that way you can actually scale up pretty easily. And talking about speed to delivery, automation really helps cut down your, from a waterfall to to its a weekly sprint or 2-week sprint, whatever your organization is decided on, and all that stuff. And lastly, that is really important, I think, it's to embrace failure, right? And to embrace, to experiment. So with automation, you can actually kind of test out certain things, certain features, whether is it good, is it bad, does it break stuff? So, and then you're sure that, all right, we have speed. If it breaks, we'll always go back to version, X-1. So I'm safe. Yeah.
Right. So now you're specifically a security-oriented individual. What kind of security benefits do folks see from application release automation, from automating that coordination and release of applications? What are you seeing?
So I'm seeing actually plugging in tools as well as expertise in the whole automation pipeline, where you can have visibility on the end-to-end kind of process, where I want to make sure you check in your code. I have a scanner, and after that, I want to make sure I can see the whole pipeline. At the end, it's like the hashes checked out, so nothing's injected, nothing's unexpected. So all that automation will help in terms of security as well, to give the visibility so you can
right.
do it at scale. Yeah.
And when it's automated, then people can't skip it, right?
Or make informed risk decisions, right? Let's say I have a scanner that says this is low vulnerability. Do you accept it before you deploy for this pipeline? That you'll be like, okay, this one's okay. But if you have a high, like a cross-site scripting really just in front of your login page, then no, that's not going to happen. So
right.
Yeah.
Right. And so you also, one of the things that if Anders were here, he would be saying is automation is auditing. Because if you've automated something, by definition, you've told the computer the steps that you're asking it to do, which makes it really easy for you to sort of walk that tree backwards and say, well, what steps did I do? Well, it's whatever I just told the automation to do. So from a security perspective, you also sort of have that, well, traceability, governance, auditability. Very good. Version tracking, yeah, all those things. Mark Priolo, what are your thoughts on some of the benefits that you're seeing or that you've heard people have experience?
Well, I mean, one is the speed. You couldn't get that type of speed with having humans doing the individual steps, with doing them manually. That was just one of the major things. When we adopted automation, it just opened up new avenues for deployment models that just were not possible no matter how many people we hired. And that was a really great win. That wasn't something we kind of foresaw. We say, hey, we could deploy faster, but then we have teams that went from deploying once quarterly, saying, you know what, we're going to deploy nightly regardless, to production. We're just going to do that nightly, and instead having 10 teams going once a quarter, we instead have 40 teams that go to production nightly. And on top of that, we're having the switch from, hey, when we have resources available, we're going to go ahead and do these models, to when it's ready, we're going to go ahead and do these models. So applications, our code is able to go to production when it's ready versus when we have resources that can do it. I mean, that's another huge win, because with models that you set up where the slowest parts are the humans that are involved, the less you have humans doing parts that they add no value to, the faster they can do what they're better at. And it sounds like a dizzying intellect when I'm talking about it, but if a person's better at coding than they are pushing the button 50 times a day, let's have them code instead of pushing the button 50 times a day, because that automation can push that button significantly faster than the human could.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, it really comes down to you automate the whole ARA, and you get rid of the bottlenecks from manual processes, and then you really allow the code to flow at the next bottleneck, which would be probably your programmer or some other part. And I hate to call a programmer a bottleneck, but then at the end of the day, something has to be.
Right. Hopefully everything after the developer is so smooth that and so predictable and so speedy that they are the bottleneck, that you're just sitting there waiting for that goodness to just the creativity or the whatever work they're working on to fall out, so that it can instantly be placed into production where the value is realized by the end users. Benefits of release automation, we've talked a little bit about that. Anyone want to have a final thought on that? Otherwise, we can move into challenges with doing application release automation at a large scale, right? And so we'll start with Fabian. What are some of your thoughts on the challenges of doing application release automation at a large scale?
At a large scale, it gets hairy, it gets scary, right? Because everyone might have their own automation pipeline, and you kind of then lose visibility in everything. So this guy has his own local bash script that does his own release automation into production or development, and the other guy has his version. So you kind of don't see the same standards around, and everyone has their own, and it's kind of a mess if it starts to scale. But if you have something standardized, like at least for your whole project team is doing, using some kind of configuration management or just some kind of a standard that would help. Yeah. Other than that, yeah, that's about it for now until more thoughts come in.
No problem. That's great. So, Mark, I know that how many applications do you mentioned some dizzying statistics right there, 40 applications every night. How many applications are in the portfolio?
Last time I checked, it was close to around 300 applications. And we have, what we try to do is we offer pipeline as a service kind of model. So we offer a limited amount of ways to get to production. And then if they take that, it's on whichever rails that they provide, or we provide. And the one that was 40, that's a model where it's literally, they have a scheduled deployment that happens every night at a certain time. Some of the other models we go with is where when the code's ready, it goes upstream at their pace. And then depending on the level of automated testing, they could either be a continuous deploy model, or they could be a continuous delivery model where they still have somebody that checks off on it, or it just goes to production with nobody that's really looking at it, because it's all been tested through the automated process. With that, it really opens up the conversation, because I think what we were talking about before, where you're scared that we have all these different teams that are doing all their different models. We kind of have the opposite, where we have to come up with one model that the entire company can use. So then we have to make sure that it meets all the check boxes that all the audits have. And what that usually ends up meaning is teams that weren't automated or were doing it through scripting before, they've been kind of flying under the radar in certain ways they were doing things. And now that they're coming over to a standardized model, their process gets audited, and those things that flew under the radar no longer fly under the radar. So that's one of the challenges that we get when we're going to this model, is when they look at it, it's like, now I have to jump through an extra hoop, and we got to point out technically you were avoiding the hoop before, and if they ever came back to audit you, you would then have to be jumping through the hoop anyways. So that's kind of the hard balance. At the same time, I can't be the whistleblower and say, I know you're not jumping through that hoop. Now you have to do that. That's one of the.
If I can rephrase that challenge, then the challenge is making sure that all the teams are buying into the vision of that automated pipeline and the standardization around that pipeline, so that you, as an architect over 40 or 300 applications, you get that visibility that you need. But the developers or the smaller teams feel that they have the flexibility and the control that they need in order to make sure that they're able to continue to ship without having you sort of get in the way. Is that?
Yeah, and even to go a little further with that, it's also the question of the check marks, and why do we have to have those check marks in place? If we have a lot of teams that are avoiding that check mark for whatever reason, they may have a valid reason why they're avoiding the check mark, and then we got to analyze that and come back and say, you know what, that check mark is no longer needed, or we modify the check mark so the ones that were avoiding it can fit in with the new model. The whole thing about it, it's always a work in progress. It's always understanding why you're doing it and how you're doing it, and not just doing it for the sake of doing it. So it's always an evolutionary process. It's always reevaluating, making sure that you're going through the right checks and balances, the right people are involved where they're needed. It's just when you're dealing with a larger scale, where you're doing it with tons of applications, hundreds of applications, sometimes collecting that information, coming with the decision comes a little longer in process. A little more vetting is needed to be done.
And does that require, from your perspective, does that sort of require more like internal marketing or not chest pounding, but sort of demonstration of here's the value that we're getting, so that this is why you should accept these hoops, if you will?
Luckily, we're at the point where we can just point to other teams that are not awake at 3 a.m. doing deployments and say, you know, these are the benefits. You don't have to look for a resource that's available to do it. You do it at your own pace. We got enough advertising outside. It's more when they come on board and then they're like, wait, we didn't sign up for this, and we gotta say, why didn't you sign up for this? And we gotta walk through what they're trying to do, and then we then see you have a valid use case, or hey, if we modify your process a little, you fall into the model that we're using. And that's really where it comes down to, is every development team is unique, and then what they're creating going to production is going to be unique. We're just trying to see if that uniqueness can fall into a pipeline to production.
Excellent. All right, Carl, what are your thoughts around challenges of application release automation at scale? What are some of the things that you've heard people talk about?
No, the biggest thing that I see is as organizations kind of get bigger and bigger, they tend to specialize. So you have people who specialize in Apache, they have people who specialize in SQL Server. Often that turns into specialized teams, which then become silos. And when you start to have all of these things come together, that becomes a real challenge. How do you have one team that is responsible for the application build deployment use one tool, have another team that's responsible for the middleware use another tool, and then have the core operating system configurations being managed by yet another team? And how do you understand how all of that work comes together, and where it conflicts, if it conflicts and where? And then if you make a change to a system, how do you understand how that affects everything else on the system? So it's a matter of two things. One is scaling expertise, having the specialized teams and individuals be able to, codify how they manage things in a standard way, and making that accessible and consumable by other teams, but also understanding how all of these teams and all these individuals work come together. And at scale, that just becomes a tremendously difficult task.
Yeah, I think that echoes based on what Fabian said around multiple different applications. It starts to become quite scary and quite hairy. And back to what Mark also said, is that getting all of these different teams to sort of adopt this standardized process to understand what the benefits of that standardization is, of that sharing, right? You have that shared resource that you provide, Mark, to all your different teams, sort of pipeline as a service, if you will, to allow them to take advantage of the best practices, of all the learnings, of all the toe stubbing that you do when you're trying to move things from the left to the right in that pipeline, and be able to make that sort of rehearsable and more predictable to the point where in production, it's been rehearsed thousands of times already. So of course it's going to work, right? Because you have fidelity across the environments because you're using configuration management. You have fidelity across for the binaries because you have the artifact repository, and the process, right? Because everybody's following that same process. Excellent.
So if I may, I just jump back on. So one of the challenge that this reminds me of when we build a pipeline, right, for the whole organization to go through. So everyone will go through the same pipeline. So we're just off the top of my head thinking about trying to isolate the security risk that you find for each application, because you have 40, or 40 projects, right? You only need one to compromise the whole pipeline per se, if something is wrong. So while designing the pipeline, you want to think about how that can be contained per app, per project, and all that stuff. So let's just use a case of, like, let's say you're using some cloud provider. You can always isolate the blast radius, if you may, of the compromise into its own account. Project X has his own X account, Project Y has your own Y account, but they're all going to go through the same pipeline. So when X gets compromised, it's just X. You close X account, you spin up a new X1 account. So that was one thing that I learned, one of my CI/CD pipeline tricks.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. So to make sure that I'm understanding it, because I'm not the smartest guy in the room.
No.
So you have, from a security perspective, scoping down the permissions for various applications, if you will, or the automation, so that you can trace that user or that application basically through that pipeline, and then eliminate the threat of any security problem by turning that user off, basically, for whatever. So that is very interesting. I think, Mark, you do that. You do some of that as well, right? There are permissions that are specific per environment.
Per environment, yeah.
Well, yeah. So we have each pipeline. They have their environment, and then the developers are control over those. But I think actually trying to go a little bit more over Fabion's model is, if you have an artifact that has that security risk in there, by going through this pipeline model, you could identify all the deployments that use that artifact, and then you could go ahead and shut all those down. And then you could redeploy a new artifact. So that's one of the other advantages with having it automated in this fashion. Instead, old school, looking at spreadsheets on what could possibly be in production, you could easily just go ahead and go to your pipeline releases and say, I know that this artifact exists on these environments, and then let's go ahead and push a newer version of that out. And that can be done in a much quicker, automated fashion than the old school of manually scoping through every environment looking for it.
Agree totally. Yeah.
So other challenges, sort of when you get to a certain size or certain number of applications in different environments, coordination of the work that's happening, teams across different projects. Any of you guys have any comments on how do you help people sort of coordinate that work and make sure that these 40 applications have been QA'd against one another, if there are some dependencies, if they're going into similar environments? Any thoughts around that, about the promotion or the tracking of that work?
Yeah, I mean, I would start off with saying that, kind of extending what I was saying earlier, it's important to merge all of the different automation tools and different things that come together to support an application together. So it's not just about the application build itself, right? It's not just about the application automation, but also the automation of everything else. All of the supporting infrastructure is incredibly important to being able to guarantee that an application is going to operate the way you expect it to when you deploy it. And having a pipeline that understands that and can accommodate for all of the different automation tools that are coming together, so that everything is being managed holistically, is incredibly important, especially at scale. When you have so many different applications that are using common technologies, such as, let's say, Apache or IIS or whatever, one single change to IIS can affect 40 different applications, right? So how you manage that, how you track those changes and all the different places that it can affect, and being able to validate that change of your middleware or core operating system or network or cloud service or whatever else it may be is incredibly important, having that visibility in testing automation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Very good.
So
All right.
Going
Go
on
ahead.
with along with the same point, like he talks about the infrastructure. So there's a saying that you should now have your infrastructure as code, and as well as security as code. So basically everything should be coded, right? As much as possible. You don't want your security eyes to be always on the infrastructure code. You want scripts and your alerting everything to be part of that infrastructure to monitor any change in your VM. Is it a legit change? Did you approve it, or was it patched? Going back to like patching your VMs and all that stuff. So that can be very difficult in the DevOps, but as well as easy if you're already scripting everything. So it's kind of a balance that you have to play.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
Coming
All right.
back, oh,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, coming back to the kind of the concept of where you're having environments that share with each other. From an artifact perspective, what we do is we enforce the maturity of an artifact. So we have 4 levels of maturity, and if other teams are using artifacts from other teams, we say that it has to be at least pre-production ready or staging ready before another team can even look at the artifact. And then that way, any artifact created by any team can be consumed by another team once it's at a point where they feel it's comfortable for the other teams to consume. So we don't run into a situation where dev team B is consuming dev team A's dev artifacts. They have to be at the point of being pretty much production ready before they can cross borders. And then it's the environment owners are the ones that are really going to dictate what is meant to match that environment based off of artifacts that are mature enough to go to those environments. So we kind of enforce the ownership. So there's going to be a team that owns the environment in question, and it's from the perspective of the environment, and not that they're the ones that have admin rights to every single piece that it can go to and do everything. They just have the tools to make sure that their environments are working at where it needs to be.
Right. Yep. And so this sort of leads us in a roundabout way to our next set of slides, which are what are some of the patterns for success that we've seen. And we've talked a little bit about trying to create that shared, standardized pipeline for people. And so how does modeling help by abstracting away the specifics? How does modeling help people be more successful? And I think I'm going to start with Carl on this one. Carl, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so modeling is critical to success in this, mainly because applications don't live in just a single environment, right? Services don't live in a single environment. You tend to work within your dev environment and then go to a pre-production, and then production may actually be several environments. You may have a hybrid model where something's in the cloud 1 minute and then it's on premise the next. So having the ability to have a model to say, when the world looks like this is how you need to deploy it, is incredibly important. But I think one thing that people often miss in that is that they think of only modeling the application. And not to sound like a broken record, but the underlying infrastructure is incredibly important too. So I'm a big proponent of modeling not just your applications, but how the underlying infrastructure that is a part of those applications. So for example, if I have a web application service, in my models, what I'll do is I'll say this web application service consumes this build, and then you also manage that service with these underlying infrastructure pieces, such as the libraries it's going to need, the middleware it's going to need, and how all of those different pieces relate to each other, so that I can deploy something out holistically and say, go deploy this service out, figure out where it needs to go, figure out the underlying infrastructure that needs to be there, and just make sure it's ready. Just go do that. I don't know what it means. You figure it out. And then past that, I'm a big proponent, as Fabian said, is everything as code. Model everything as code. Write your infrastructure as code. Write your your cloud services as code, right? Your pipelines as code. Absolutely everything is code, so it can be version controlled and introspected and peer reviewed and tested and deployed at any moment.
Yeah, and refactorable and testable and repeat. Yeah, all of those things. Versionable, having it as code. We talk about process as code at Electric Cloud, because that process, if you have all the right ingredients, you have all the right equipment, but you're using it all in the wrong order, you're not going to get the right outcome. So making sure that you've modeled that pipeline, that process, like you mentioned, and making sure that you have the ability to sort of replay that, but not brittle way, in an abstracted way that you can sort of replay in general. Here's how things are supposed to go, and it can sort of flow around the different actual use cases or situations that you run yourself into. Very, very important. Very good point. Thank you, Carl. Mark, what are your thoughts on this modeling? How does modeling help?
Trying to go a little further with that, it definitely helps, because one of the challenges I've seen in the past is that you don't want your dev to be like your production environment. You don't want to spend the money on getting the same type of load balancers, the same type of configurations that you have in there, because it feels like it's throwing away money. So trying to argue that if you want a successful production environment, you need it downstream, so that you're not testing in production, you're testing downstream. So the modeling is really important about that, taking the entire environment into account, and not just the code portion or just the website portion, but how the entire environment is going to interact within your own infrastructure or within the cloud, and how it's going to be seen by the client. And that needs to be done on dev. You have to be able to at least have it at scale in dev with the same exact type of configurations. Nothing's more wonderful than testing your load balance web servers in production for the first time, or seeing if SQL clustering works in production, right? 5 minutes before the client's going to start logging in. So that's really where the value comes in. It's a harder battle, and like I said, I've seen it at previous places where trying to have that saying really needs to be like production downstream. So you're throwing this, $500,000 firewall in production. We need to be able to use a $500,000 firewall in dev, even though dev has no reason other than making sure it works.
Right. And again, if you can abstract that definitive sort of requirement away and just say as part of the process, it's, we're not exercising that part of the process right now because we don't have that machine to do it against, but service virtualization comes up quite a bit as a way to help allow you to flip the bits that you would need to flip in production without actually having to purchase the production equipment. And if you model that in, then the target for whatever it is that you're doing can change because you've abstracted it away. But the response that you should get back should fulfill the promise of that SLA with that target. And that's why the virtualization may work. Do you guys use any service virtualization
Yeah, we definitely do. And I say that kind of going through that, coming back to the concept of, hey, we need to move over to have dev really be like production, just at a smaller scale, but with the same exact kind of architecture, really adds to that decision making. Should we buy a unique firewall that only will be in production, or should we look at other models that can be used downstream? So instead of having a hardware firewall, maybe a software firewall will be just as good, plus we can use it downstream. So that also dictates how the overall picture looks, and we stop looking at each environment as being its own silo, and we look at it as being a piece of the larger picture at that point.
Right, the more system level thinking, which as Carl mentioned earlier, if you're not thinking at the system level, then you're going to be optimizing the wrong stuff. You'll optimize for the local thing. That's great. Fabian, what are your thoughts on this modeling, and how does it maybe impact security?
So for modeling, I was listening to both their points. They make really valid points and things I was going to say, but spinning off of that, when you say you replicate like environments from a production to a development, or even if you have a staging, right, things that you're making sure that things are going to work. So a lot of money is being thrown in, and things like security tools aren't that cheap also. right? Your firewall, your application scanners, and all that stuff. So virtualizing actually helps a lot to cut that cost quite a bit. And another thing is, what if your developers want to model something on their local machines? And do they all get their own separate dev mini environments, just for their testing for their local machines, local tests? Or, how do you guys actually define that? What is dev? Is dev local, or is it like a shared resource service, or is that like a pre-production? Because everyone has their own definition of development environment. So
Yeah.
if we can replicate that that production environment, even at a smaller scale, maybe our laptops or just a simulation, I think that would help speed up even more of pushing to production. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you've modeled it well,
Yeah.
then the buttons that people push for dev, it'll target the right kind of environment with the right kind of stuff in it. But it's the exact same button that you'd need to push to promote it into staging. It's the exact same button that you'd need to push. And so you're rehearsing that
Right.
same process, that same environment configuration, that same artifact across all these different stages without having to make any changes, because making changes after you've done the first test, a different variable now, another variable into your experiment, if you will, the experiment of trying to move these things down the track, which can cause problems, and the non-deterministic outcomes that don't necessarily have anything to do with the work that the developer did. You're introducing problems the developer did, which is not the, that's everything else should be locked down, but the one change the developer made. All right, very good. Anybody else have any comments on modeling? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is sort of automation, the pattern for success of automation. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but we'll come back to that and find out what are some of the things that you guys have seen, how automation has helped from a pattern of success. And I'll start with Mark.
So automation is, I guess, the bread and butter of what I try and do. As jokingly as I say, a little while into this job, is my goal is to automate automation. And what I mean by that is, almost when you talk to any team, and this is true with any company, you ask them, hey, what would it take to automate your stuff? And they say, what are you talking about? It's already automated. I have 50 batch scripts, and I just go ahead and click on one after another, and it does it all. And then I got to point out, well, you kind of updated part of the things to be more streamlined, but let's automate that. So I tried to coin the term, I automate automation. The automation as a whole is really kind of what I was just talking about throughout this whole thing. It really allows the ability for things that people add no real value doing, or is actually a waste of those people's times doing, to get that out of the way and let them concentrate on what really matters to the company, and really reclaim that busy work time and allow us to move at speeds that were much faster than before, allow us to do things that we were not capable of doing, no matter how much manpower we threw at it. Just a fact with our deployments now, including from our dev to our production environments, we're averaging 4,500, close to 5,000 a month. And before that, it was just not possible with having that many people trying to do deployments all day long. So that's one of the major benefits, just simply the speed that we can move at. The other benefits comes to consistency, repeatability. Every time we do an automated deployment, we know it's going to work, how it's going to work every time. If there's a problem, the automation usually has extremely good logs. It's repeatable. If you run into a problem with a deployment, guess what? If you try to do the same exact deployment again, there's a good chance you're going to get the same exact error again. And that's something that if you do it manually, hey, maybe that second time it worked. I don't know. Maybe I shook the Oracle bones a different way this time. I don't know. So that's the other thing that really comes with automation. And then you also start getting higher level of confidences on your deployments. When you're going upstream and you know that, hey, I deployed it to dev and it worked. I deployed it to QA and it worked. I deployed it to pre-prod and it worked. And all I did was press the same button 3 times. You're really going to get confident that pushing that button that 4th time to production, it's going to work. When you do it manually, behind the scenes, you know things are not being done exactly the same. And I've had some teams that commented that when it went to pre-prod, we weren't too sure, like it worked, but we weren't too sure when it goes to prod if we were going to get the same result. And that's really where the automation comes in. It's that consistency. Every time it's going to happen the same way. It also allows the development teams to actually start looking at automation as a part of what they're delivering. It allows them to feel better ownership about what's going to production versus, hey, this is just the code, it's just my part and that's it. Instead, you're switching it over to it's the entire package and the way it interacts with the environment. So there's I've been seeing that developers feel tighter ownership over what they're delivering.
Nice.
I could go on.
The developers of the pipeline?
The developers of the artifacts or the code that goes into the pipeline. So since we offer pipeline as a service, we're actually the developers of the pipeline. They can go ahead and deliver the artifacts into the pipeline that's used. It's just that they have control over how the artifacts actually interact with the servers to a degree that's needed. So they feel tighter ownership of the environments it's being deployed to.
Nice. All right, right on. Hey, Fabian, what are your thoughts on this as far as automation and the pattern for success? What kinds of things would you recommend for people?
He's hit all the good points. So automation is trying to make myself useless, right? The more I make myself useless, the more I've automated a lot of stuff. So claiming back my busy hours, and trying to do things that I'm passionate or / useful for, like decision makings, right? In automation, you can always automate your tools. We see security tools as yet another tool, like a testing tool is no different from like a, just another testing tool. So you want to automate all of that and, bring out that vulnerability report or some kind of assessment to you. And then you say, okay, do I accept all those risks, right? And you don't want to be manually doing all that for each individual application or / environment. So using tools in this automation, it's quite awesome that you can actually see all that at the beginning, even before your release. So that way you can actually stop it just in case it gets out the gate. Another thing about automation that I think is really important is how are you identifying, control within each application. Like your microservices can talk to each other. Like that's automation to me, right? Because you're not actually invoking, okay, I'm going to run this now, and then I'm going to run that. So managing all that teeny weeny, configurations and control that can be very challenging. But when managed properly, each teams get their own API keys, and make sure that they store it properly. All that stuff can actually help the automation process really well and kind of lower your risk, right? If you have the same pipeline, everyone's using the same microservices, then okay, there's a logs, and then you can track, what everyone's doing. So
right, yep. Great, and we'll talk a little bit more about how do you do that across lots of different things in the next topic, which is coordination, right? Carl, automation.
Well,
for success there.
Yeah, so I think, when I talk to people about automation, everybody's sold that they need to do it. Like, I don't need to convince them, you need to automate. Like, we all know that. The biggest challenge for people is where do you get started? And I talk to a lot of people where they say things like, we're gonna automate this huge application that's just a super big pain for us that we spend 3 hours every 4 months working on. And then you talk to them and say, okay, well, that's great. So you spend 4 hours, have this really painful thing that you do every few months. What is the thing that adds up to 4 hours a week that you do, or 4 hours that you spend a week on, all right, that you do every single week? Start there. Automate that. Automate the low-hanging fruit. Always start with the things that you can just easily grasp, and then use the law of accelerating returns to automate more and more. If you start with the big painful things, you're going to get extremely little value in return. You're still going to be putting out fires all the time. You're still going to be fixing problems that you shouldn't be fixing. And you're still going to have less, less space in your process. if you start with the little things that you do all the time, that's a great place to start. The other thing that I see that people kind of have fear over is when I talk about the importance of continuous delivery. And a lot of people I talk to say, well, we're not ready for continuous delivery because we're not ready for, complete automation of our tests. Like we don't have everything automated in our tests. And that's a bad mentality to have. What I recommend people get started with is just get your pipeline. Even if you don't have any automated testing, get a pipeline. Even if that testing phase is manual right now, get started there, because now once you have a pipeline, you have a place to measure. Now you can look at the pipeline and say, I know that this is where the problems are occurring. We don't have any automated testing in this part of the pipeline, and it keeps causing problems in the next stage. Therefore, automate that next. So having some place that you can measure and visualize that is shared across all the different teams that interact with the product delivery process is critical to understanding what you should automate when.
I love that. That's absolutely right.
Sorry, I gotta hop in here and just double what Carl said regarding doing the repetitive tasks first over the thing that you do every few months. We kind of did both routes, and the tremendous wins on doing the repetitive tasks, which nobody thought was an issue or was consuming as much time as it was, really made a huge difference on the whole automation front. I can't stress that enough. Choose the things that you think don't need to be automated first, but it's just taking a lot of time, because that really, really gets the momentum going with automation.
And that's where you win a lot of that time back. Those are very good points. All very good points. All right. So our last topic then is we've modeled, we've automated, and now we're doing this at scale, right? We talked about that earlier. How do you now help coordinate, and what's important for folks to think about when they're thinking about coordinating all this work? What are some of the patterns for success that you've seen that have helped you or that have helped people that you've worked with to do this? And Fabian, I'm going to start with you.
All right. Coordination, it's really starting with communication. Probably any changes you want to do in your pipeline, or just anything, right? In general, you want to communicate that, telling them that you're going to make this change and then no surprises and stuff like that. So things, it's the same for security violations per se. If people are using bad libraries, people are doing things that are bad, like opening their security firewall to the world because they didn't know they were testing. Right? They would, I don't know what ports I need to open, so I just open everything to everyone. So things like that needs a lot of education, coordination, and it has happened a lot of times, right? And in order for us to detect it at scale, then you need some kind of a tool to help you, and as well as coordination, right? And because usually those logs don't go to them as much because they think it's normal. Oh, I'm opening up everything to the world. Yeah, I did it. That's cool. It's legit. But to us, from a security point of view, it's like, no, don't open your build server to the world, because it's your development machine and you can get owned and all that stuff. So a lot of education from my end. Yeah, trying to tell them to do the right thing, one at a time, or even like an email or something.
Yeah. Do you use any tool like Slack or something to help with that collaboration, with that communication?
Yeah, we do. We do Slack and Telegram and some kind of messaging.
Right. Yeah. Making sure that everybody is aware of what's going on is super important. Carl, what are your thoughts about sort of that coordination aspect, and when you're moving things through the pipeline, how do you see people sort of patterns for success on that coordination?
The biggest success that I've seen is when people tie it back to their project management system, whether that's a ticket management system or some way of tracking the requirements going in. One of the things that I talk a lot about is the importance that continuous delivery has on product management, and having that the ability to understand exactly when something is going to go out, and it helps with the planning process. So if you tie that in the beginning and understand that this feature needs to go out and it's dependent on these different teams and these different pipelines in order to come together at this point, and how you track that milestone, is really, really critical for overall success, especially when you get to scale. And in scale here, I'm talking about organizational scale, not technical scale. So I think one of the big successes that I've seen is when people tie their pipeline changes and phases back into the tickets that are tracking that work and tracking the requirements of the application.
So bringing it back into the stories that are being run in that particular sprint, is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
What features are being implemented, right? And that way you get, from a metrics perspective, which I love that idea that you talked about of making sure that you know, whether or not the pipeline is useful as an actual thing, it's actually useful for you to be able to judge where are the problems, where are the bottlenecks in that value stream, if you will, regardless if you call it a deployment pipeline or that value stream of how you move things over. I think that's a great point as far as using that as a way to guide you and judge where the issues are, and then from a coordination perspective, being able to let people see, yep, this piece of work started here because of this requirement, and it got up to here, and then it faced, right, because we did some coordination with some other, because somebody else had some other thing that they were also trying to put into this pipeline, and these two things somehow collided in SIT, in integration testing, for some reason.
Yep.
But at least you can back it up to what was the business requirement. Changes. We're running an experiment. We're putting new code in the system. Why are we doing it, right? And which one of these, if we have to back one out or if we have to do something, which one of these is the most important one to make sure we maintain, and the other one, can we change it to eliminate that problem? I think that's all right. Anything else? Oh, go ahead, Fabian.
If I may, so that reminds me that in my previous company, that we do give like the tickets back to the developers, or to the project managers regarding environmental changes that are deemed as high risk. So that way they get that kind of metrics, and they can track that kind of coordination and all that stuff. And also we can actually see what is going on, and it's a way for us to tell them, hey, you need to do this as a task, rather than ad hocly sending an email or just slacking them. Right now, they do have a task to do. So, yeah, that's a great point. Tying back to the ticketing,
the checklist manifesto, right? It's nice to, if only we were computers and we could do everything without fail and not get distracted by a tweet or by some XKCD comic or whatever that we just saw. But we can't do that. At least I can't do that. I get distracted pretty easily. What? Just kidding. Mark, what are your thoughts on?
I was going to say, it felt like a loaded question, because basically the culture of DevOps is what really it comes down to, right? When I'm talking about coordination, I was thinking of it more from a perspective of coordination between people and teams. And that's really what it comes down to, is making sure that the teams are openly communicating with each other. It's also making sure that they have the information that's needed. They have the tools to make those informed decisions when they're coordinating with each other. So right now you got the formula where you have a whole bunch of operations teams, development teams, project manager teams all working together. You got to make sure they're lined up in the right order. With before, when we were doing it more manual, we were a little bit more on the tail end of operations heavy, where operations would get involved late in the game. And what we did when we're switching over to more of a continuous delivery model is making sure operations gets involved earlier in the process. And realistically, the only time operations should be involved late in the process is there's something wrong and we have a 5-alarm fire and we need somebody to look at it. That's the only time we should really have them involved later in the process. Saying that, though, it's also you get you got to worry about the balance between dev and ops in that situation, because then the dev feels like they have more power and try and lower the importance of ops, and then they some teams, and I've heard this around, go from a DevOps model to a dev-dev model, and that's the one thing we need to avoid, is a dev-dev model. Dev and ops are equally important to the process, and we got to make sure that both have the right weight on what they're doing.
Yeah.
So that's one of the critical things that we always got to make sure that we're balancing here, and I've heard from other companies too, is we want to make sure that it's not ops heavy or dev heavy. It's a balance because both teams are contributing to it. And the overall picture is everybody's goal is for the entire thing to win and not just for their deliverable to win.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been talking about here quite a bit is DevOps is really great. Ops people, sometimes they're a little afraid of it. And one of the ways that you can make them more comfortable with it is when you start with the end in mind, and you start with whatever work we're doing on the dev side, we need to make sure that it is building up in a rehearsable, repeatable way to whatever we actually need to provide in operations. And so the whole idea of modeling and the whole idea of automation, if you're modeling things that will, in dev, that will never work in ops, then you've failed, right? Because now you're creating something that can't be rehearsed without having some sort of contortion at the last minute when you need to put it into the ops world. And so ideally you'd have everything sort of set up from a dev perspective that you can just kind of hit the button, get a cookie, hit the button, get a cookie, all the way through, right? But that's a really hard thing to do, and we talked about that a little bit earlier because of the changes in the environments and things like that. But if you start with the end in mind and you let the dev people work with the ops people, that coordination, that collaboration, then you're much more likely to have an outcome in operations that is going to be fit for that environment, that can also then be repurposed and used in a more superficial way, right? You don't have the same equipment that you would have in operations or in production on a dev side, right? They can use that same script, they can use that same environment, even though some of it's virtualized. So I think that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, I kind of agree with him with the coordination and stuff, because coming from a security background, I don't want to be like an arm's length away from the DevOps team, be like, oh, you're just a gatekeeper, be like, you don't know what we're doing, kind of thing. But doing DevOps myself, so putting security in mind, which I think is as important as everything else, that sort of balance gives me a chance to say, I do DevOps as well, right? I code, I develop my own pipeline, as in I develop my own app building through the same pipeline. So I go through the same thing, but here's a little tweak that we'll all be more safe if we do this, right? Okay, I'm going to improve the scripts, I'm going to improve the pipeline. So we're all in the same boat. So that's my message I want to tell them, rather than saying, nope, you're not supposed to do this. I always look at how are we going to make this work and lower our risk. That's all. I'm always looking for. Yeah.
Yes, and not no but, right? It's yes and.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Usually I find that trying to get teams to adopt something new, and even if it's better in the long run, if it isn't easier for them in the short run, it's going to be an uphill battle. So like if you find a vulnerability or something, you got to find an easier way for them to not have the vulnerability than to keep the vulnerability.
Make it more painful to keep the bad state than to get to the good state. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Anybody else have any final thoughts? We got 2 minutes left.
As we close out, I just wanted to say is if people get started with application automation, remember to include everyone. It's really easy to look at application automation and just think about the build that needs to get deployed and how in architecting a system that makes that possible. When really your infrastructure is made up of a lot of different teams, a lot of different technologies, all coming together to deliver the value to your customers. And it's important to look at the entire picture and understand how all of it comes together so that you know which bits need to be automated when.
Amen, right? Fidelity of environment, fidelity of artifact, fidelity of process. These things are all very important from an application release automation perspective. Coordination of all that work, making sure you get that high level visibility around what's happening so that you can assure compliance with a process, so that you can audit what happened, so that you can not have people avoid doing critical steps in order to hurry something up, bypassing all the security checks, for instance, because you don't want to take the time because it's a critical bug and you have to get it out right away, may not be doing you any favors in the long run. Are super important. been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you guys joining. Fabian, thank you very much for staying up so late on Buddha Day, Vesca in Singapore. We're very happy to have had you. Carl and Mark, thank you both for joining, and we'll see you next week. 2 weeks on another episode of Continuous Discussion.